Welcome to Part 6 of Psych for Psychology's reading of Psychology, the book by William James. Chapter 12. The Self, the Me, and the I. Whatever I may be thinking of, I am always at the same time more or less aware of myself, of my personal existence. At the same time it is I who am aware, so that the total self of me, being as it were duplex, partly known and partly knower, partly object and partly subject, must have two aspects discriminated in it, of which for shortness we may call one the me and the other the I. I call these discriminated aspects, and not separate things, because the identity of I with me, even in the very act of their discrimination, is perhaps the most ineradicable dictum of common sense, and must not be undermined by our terminology here at the outset, whatever we may come to think of its validity at our inquiry's end. I shall therefore treat successively of A, the self as known, or the me, the empirical ego as it is sometimes called, and a B, the self as knower, or the I, the pure ego of certain authors, A, the self as known, the empirical self or me, between what a man calls me and what he simply calls mine, the line is difficult to draw. We feel and act about certain things that are ours, very much as we feel and act about ourselves. Our fame, our children, the work of our hands, may be as dear to us as our bodies are, and arouse the same feelings, and the same acts of reprisal if attacked. And our bodies themselves, are they simply ours, or are they us? Certainly men have been ready to disown their very bodies and to regard them as mere vestures, or even as prisons of clay from which they should some day be glad to escape. We see then that we are dealing with a fluctuating material of the same object being sometimes treated as a part of me, at other times as simply mine, and then again as if I had nothing to do with it at all. In its widest possible sense, however, a man's me is the sum total of all that he can call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house, his wife and children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses, and yacht and bank account. All these things give him the same emotions. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down, not necessarily in the same degree for each thing, but in much the same way for all. Understanding the me in this widest sense, we may begin by dividing the history of it into three parts, relating respectively to A, its constituents, and B, the feelings and emotions they arouse, self-appreciation, C, the act to which they prompt, self-seeking and self-preservation. A, the constituents of the me may be divided into two classes, those which make up respectively the material me, the social me, and the spiritual me. The material me, the body is the innermost part of the material me in each of us, and certain parts of the body seem more intimately ours than the rest. The clothes come next. The old saying that the human person is composed of three parts, soul, body, and clothes, is more than a joke. We so appropriate our clothes and identify ourselves with them that there are few of us who, if asked to choose between having beautiful body clad in raiment perpetually shabby and unclean, and having an ugly and blemished form always spotlessly attired, would not hesitate a moment before making decisive reply. Next, our immediate family is part of ourselves. Our father and mother, our wife and babes, are bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. When they die, a part of our very selves is gone. If they do anything wrong, it is our shame. If they are insulted, our anger flashes forth as readily as if we stood in their place. Our home comes next. Its scenes are part of our life. Its aspects awaken the tenderest feelings of affection, and we do not easily forgive the stranger who, in visiting it, finds fault with its arrangements or treats it with contempt. All these different things are the objects of instinctive preferences coupled with the most important practical interests of life. We all have a blind impulse to watch over our body, to deck it with clothing of an ornamental sort, to cherish parents, wife, and babes, and to find for ourselves a house of our own which we may live in and improve. An equally instinctive impulse drives us to collect property, and the collections thus made become, with different degrees of intimacy, parts of our empirical selves. The parts of our wealth most intimately ours are those which are saturated with our labor. There are few men who would not feel personally annihilated if a lifelong construction of their hands or brains, say an entomological collection or an extensive work in manuscript, were suddenly swept away. The miser feels similarly towards his gold, and although it is true that a part of our depression, the loss of possessions, is due to our feeling that we must now go without certain goods that we expected the possessions to bring in their train, yet in every case there remains, over and above this, a sense of the shrinkage of our personality, a partial conversion of ourselves to nothingness, which is a psychological phenomenon by itself. We are all at once assimilated to the tramps and poor devils whom we so despise, and at the same time removed farther than ever away from the happy sons of earth who lord it over land and sea in men in the full-blown lustihood that wealth and power can give, and before whom stiffen ourselves as we will by appealing to anti-snobbish first principles. We cannot escape an emotion, open or sneaking, of respect and dread. The social me. A man's social me is recognition which he gets from his mates. We are not only gregarious animals, liking to be in sight of our fellows, but we have an innate propensity to get ourselves noticed, and noticed favorably by our kind. No more fiendish punishment could be devised, were such a thing physically possible, than that one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by all the members thereof. If no one turned round when we entered, answered when we spoke, or minded what we did, but if every person we met cut us dead, and acted as if we were non-existing things, a kind of rage and impotent despair would ere long well up in us, from which the cruelest bodily tortures would be a relief, for these would make us feel that, however bad might be our plight, we had not sunk to such a depth as to be unworthy of attention at all. Properly speaking, a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their mind. To wound any one of these as images is to wound him, but as the individuals who carry the images fall naturally into classes, we may practically say that he has as many different social selves as there are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion he cares. He generally shows a different side of himself to each of these different groups. Many a youth who is demure enough before his parents and teachers swears and swaggers like a pirate among his tough young friends. We do not show ourselves to our children as to our club companions, to our customers as to the laborers we employ, to our own masters and employers as to our intimate friends. From this there results what practically is a division of the man into several selves, and this may be a discordant splitting, as where one is afraid to let one set up. His acquaintances know him as he is elsewhere, where it may be a perfectly harmonious division of labor, as where one tender to his children is stern to the soldiers or prisoners under his command. The most peculiar social self which one is apt to have is in the mind of the person one is in love with. The good or bad fortunes of this self cause the most intense elation and dejection, unreasonable enough as measured by every other standard than that of the organic feeling of individual. To his own consciousness he is not, so long as this particular social self fails to get recognition, and when it is recognized his contentment passes all bounds. A man's fame, good or bad, and his honor or dishonor are names for one of his social selves. The particular social self of a man called his honor is usually the result of one of those splittings of which we have spoken. It is his image in the eyes of his own set, which exalts or condemns him as he conforms or not to certain requirements that may not be made of one in another walk of life. Thus, a layman may abandon a city infected with cholera, but a priest or a doctor would think such an act incompatible with his honor. A soldier's honor requires him to fight or to die under circumstances where another man can apologize or run away with no stain upon his social self. A judge, a statesman, are in like manner debarred by the honor of their call from entering into pecuniary relations perfectly honorable to persons in private life. Nothing is commoner than to hear people discriminate between their different selves of this sort. As a man I pity you, but as an official I must show you no mercy. As a politician I regard him as an ally, but as a moralist I loathe him better, etc. What may be called club opinion. One of the very strongest forces in life. The thief must not steal from other thieves. The gambler must pay his gambling debts, though he pay no other debts in the world. The code of honor of fashionable society has throughout history been full of permissions as well as of vetoes. The only reason for following either of which is that so we best serve one of our social selves. You must not lie in general, but you may lie as much as you please if asked about your relation. With a lady you must accept the challenge from an equal, but if challenged by an inferior you may laugh him to scorn. These are examples of what is meant. The spiritual me. By the spiritual me, so far as it belongs to the empirical self, I mean no one of my passing states of consciousness. I mean rather the entire collection of my states of consciousness, my psychic faculties and dispositions taken concretely. This collection can at any moment become an object to my thought at that moment and awaken emotions like those awakened by any of the other portions of the me. When we think of ourselves as thinkers, all the other ingredients of our me seem relatively external possessions. Even within the spiritual me, some ingredients seem more external than others. Our capacities for sensation, for example, are less intimate possessions, so to speak, than our emotions and desires. Our intellectual processes are less intimate than our volitional decisions. The more active feeling states of consciousness are thus the more central portions of the spiritual me. The very core and nucleus of our self, as we know it, the very sanctuary of our life, is the sense of activity which certain inner states possess. This sense of activity is often held to be a direct revelation of the living substance of our soul. Whether this be so or not is an ulterior question. I wish now only to lay down the peculiar internality of whatever states possess this quality of seeming to be active. It is as if they went out to meet all the other elements of our experience. In thus feeling about them, probably all men agree. b. The feelings and emotions of self come after the constituents. Self-appreciation. This is of two sorts, self-complacency and self-dissatisfaction. Self-love more properly belongs under the division C of acts, since what men mean by that name is rather a set of motor tendencies than a kind of feeling properly so called. Language has synonyms enough for both kinds of self-appreciation. Thus pride, conceit, vanity, self-esteem, arrogance, vainglory on the one hand, and on the other modesty, humility, confusion, diffidence, shame, mortification, contrition, the sense of obloquy, and personal despair. These two opposite classes of affection seem to be direct, elementary endowments of our nature. Associationists would have it that they are, on the other hand, secondary phenomena arising from a rapid computation of the sensible pleasures or pains to which our prosperous or debased personal predicament is likely to lead, the sum of the represented pleasures forming this self-satisfaction, and the sum of the represented pains forming the opposite feeling of shame. No doubt, when we are self-satisfied, we do fondly rehearse all possible rewards for our desert, and when in a fit of self-despair we forebode evil. But the mere expectation of reward is not the self-satisfaction, and the mere apprehension of the evil is not the self-despair, for there is a certain average tone of self-feeling which each one of us carries about with him, and which is independent of the objective reasons we may have for satisfaction or discontent. That is, a very meanly conditioned man may abound in unfaltering conceit, and one whose success in life is secure, and who is esteemed by all, remain diffident of his powers to the end. One may say, however, that the normal provocative of self-feeling is one's actual success or failure, and the good or bad actual position one holds in the world. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I!" A man with a broadly extended empirical ego, with powers that have uniformly brought him success, with place and wealth and friends and fame, is not likely to be visited by morbid diffidences and doubts about himself which he had when he was a boy. Is not this great Babylon which I have planted? Whereas he who has made one blunder after another, and still lies in middle life among the failures at the foot of the hill, is liable to grow all sickly towards self-distrust, and to shrink from trials with which his powers can really cope. The emotions themselves of self-satisfaction and abasement are of a unique sort. Each is worthy to be classed as a primitive emotional species, as are, for example, rage or pain. Each has its own peculiar physiognomical expression. In self-satisfaction, the extensor muscles are innervated, the eyes strong and glorious, the gait rolling and elastic, the nostril dilated. A peculiar smile plays upon the lips. This whole complex of symptoms is seen in an exquisite way in lunatic asylums, which always contain some patients who are literally mad with conceit, and whose fatuous expression and absurdly strutting or swaggering gait is in tragic contrast with their lack of any valuable personal quality. It is in these same castles of despair that we find the strongest examples of the opposite physiognomy in good people who think they have committed the unpardonable sin, and are lost forever, who crouch and cringe and slink from notice, and are unable to speak aloud or look us in the eye. Like fear and like anger, in similar morbid conditions, these opposite feelings of self may be aroused with no adequate exciting cause. And in fact we ourselves know how the barometer of our self-esteem and confidence rises and falls from one day to another through causes that seem to be visceral and organic rather than rational, and which answer to no corresponding variations in the esteem in which we are held by our friends. See, self-seeking and self-preservation come next. These words cover a large number of our fundamental instinctive impulses. We have those of bodily self-seeking, those of social self-seeking, and those of spiritual self-seeking. Bodily self-seeking. All the ordinary useful reflex actions and movements of alimentation and defense are acts of bodily self-preservation. Fear and anger prompt acts that are useful in the same way. Whilst if by self-seeking we mean the providing for the future as distinguished from maintaining the present, we must class both anger and fear, together with the hunting, the acquisitive, the home-constructing, and the tool-constructing instincts as impulses to self-seeking of the bodily kind. Really, however, these latter instincts, with amativeness, parental fondness, curiosity, and emulation, seek not only the development of the bodily me, but that of the material me in the widest possible sense of the word. Our social self-seeking, in turn, is carried on directly through our amativeness and friendliness, our desire to please and attract notice and admiration, our emulation and jealousy, Our love of glory, influence, and power, and indirectly through whichever of the material self-seeking impulses prove serviceable as means to social ends, that the direct social self-seeking impulses are probably pure instincts is easily seen. A noteworthy thing about the desire to be recognized by others is that its strength has so little to do with the worth of the recognition computed in sensational or rational terms. We are crazy to get a visiting list which shall be large, to be able to say when any one is mentioned, "Well, I know him well," and to be bowed to in the street by half the people we meet. Of course, distinguished friends and admiring recognition are the most desirable. Thackeray somewhere asks his readers to confess whether it would not give each of them an exquisite pleasure to be met walking down Pall Mall with a duke on either arm. But in default of dukes and envious solutions, almost anything will do for some of us, and there is a whole race of beings today who is passionate to keep their names in the newspapers, no matter under what heading: arrivals and departures, personal paragraphs, interviews, gossip, even scandal, will suit them if nothing better is to be had. Guido, Garfield's assassin, is an example of the extremity to which this sort of craving for the notoriety of print may go in, a pathological case. The newspapers bounded his mental horizon, and in the poor wretch's prayer on the scaffold, one of the most heartfelt expressions was, "The newspaper press of this land has a big bill to settle with thee, O Lord, not only the people but the places and things I know and large myself in." A sort of metaphoric social way, imicanate, as the French workman says of the implement he can use well. So that it comes about that persons for whose opinion we care nothing are nevertheless persons whose notice we woo, and that many a man truly great, many a woman truly fastidious in most respects, will take a deal of trouble to dazzle some insignificant cad whose whole personality they heartily despise. Under the head of spiritual self-seeking ought to be included every impulse towards psychic progress, whether intellectual, moral, or spiritual in the narrow sense of the term. It must be admitted, however, that much that commonly passes for spiritual self-seeking in this narrow sense is only material and social self-seeking beyond the grave. In the Mohammedan desire for paradise and the Christian aspiration not to be damned in hell, the materiality of the goods sought is undisguised. In the more positive and refined view of heaven, many of its goods, the fellowship of the saints and of our dead ones, and the presence of God, are but social goods of the most exalted kind. It is only the search of the redeemed inward nature, the spotlessness from sin, whether here or hereafter, that can count as spiritual self-seeking pure and undefiled. But this broad external review of the facts of the life of the me will be incomplete without some count of the rivalry and conflict of the different mess. With most objects of desire, physical nature restricts our choice to but one of many represented goods, and even so it is here. I am often confronted by the necessity of standing by one of my empirical selves and relinquishing the rest. Not that I would not, if I could, be both handsome and fat and well-dressed, and a great athlete, and make $1 million a year, be a wit, a bon vivant, and a lady-killer, as well as a philosopher, a philanthropist, statesman, warrior, and African explorer, as well as a tone poet and saint. But the thing is simply impossible. The millionaire's work would run counter to the saint's, the bon vivant and the philanthropist would trip each other up. The philosopher and the lady-killer could not well keep house in the same tenement of clay. Such different characters may conceivably at the outset of life be alike possible to a man, but to make any one of them actual, the rest must more or less be suppressed. So the seeker of his truest, strongest, deepest self must review the list carefully and pick out the one on which to stake his salvation. All other selves thereupon become unreal, but the fortunes of this self are real. Its failures are real failures. Its triumphs real triumphs, carrying shame and gladness with them. This is as strong an example as there is of that selective industry of the mind on which I insisted some pages back. Our thought, incessantly deciding, among many things of a kind which once for it shall be realities, here chooses one of many possible selves or characters, and forthwith reckons it no shame to fail in any of those not adopted expressly as its own. So we have the paradox of a man shamed to death because he is only the second pugilist or the second oarsman in the world, that he is able to beat the whole population of the globe minus one is nothing. He had hitted himself to beat that one, and as long as he doesn't do that, nothing else counts. He is to his own regard as if he were not. Indeed he is not. Yonder puny fellow, however, whom every one can beat, suffers no chagrin about it, for he has long ago abandoned the attempt to carry that line, as the merchants say, of self at all. With no attempt there can be no failure, and with no failure, no humiliation. So our self-feeling in this world depends entirely on what we back ourselves to be and do. It is determined by the ratio of our actualities to our supposed potentialities, a fraction of which our pretensions are the denominator and the numerator our success. Thus self-esteem equals success over pretensions. Such a fraction may be increased as well by diminishing the denominator as by increasing the numerator. To give up pretensions is as blessed a relief as to get them gratified, and where disappointment is incessant and the struggle unending. It is what men will always do. The history of evangelical theology, with its conviction of sin, its self-despair, and its abandonment of salvation by works, is the deepest of possible examples. But we meet others in every walk of life. There is the strangest lightness about the heart when one's nothingness in a particular line is once accepted in good faith. All is not bitterness in the lot of the lover sent away by the final inexorable no. Many Bostonians, creed experto, and inhabitants of other cities, too, I fear, would be happier women and men today, if they could once for all abandon the notion of keeping up a musical self, and without shame let people hear them call a symphony in nuisance. How pleasant is the day when we give up striving to be young or slender. Thank God, we say, those illusions are gone. Everything added to the self is burden as well as pride. Certain man who lost every penny during our Civil War went and actually rolled in the dust, saying he had not felt so free and happy since he was born. Once more, then, our self-feeling is in our power. As Carlyle says, make thy claim of wages zero, then haste thou the world under thy feet. Well did the wisest of our time write, it is only with renunciation that life, properly speaking, is said to begin. Neither threats nor pleadings can move a man unless they touch someone of his potential or actual selves. Only thus can we, as a rule, get a purchase on another's will. The first care of diplomatists and monarchs and all who wish to rule or influence is, accordingly, to find out their victim's strongest principle of self-regard so as to make that the fulcrum of all appeals. But if a man has given up those things which are subject to foreign fate and ceased to regard them as parts of himself at all, we are well nigh powerless over him. The Stoic receipt for intendment was to dispossess yourself in advance of all that was out of your own power, then fortune's shocks might rain down unfelt. Epictetus exhorts us, by thus narrowing and at the same time solidifying ourselves, to make it invulnerable. I must die, well, but must I die groaning too? I will speak what appears to be right, and if the despot says, then I will put you to death, I will reply, when did I ever tell you that I was immortal? You will do your part, and I mine. It is yours to kill, and mine to die intrepid, yours to banish, mine to depart untroubled. How do we act in a voyage? We choose the pilot, the sailors, the hour. Afterwards comes a storm. What have I to care for? My part is performed. This matter belongs to the pilot. But the ship is sinking. What then have I to do? That which alone I can do, submit to being drowned, without fear, without clamor or accusing of God. But as one who knows that what is born must likewise die, this Stoic fashion, though efficacious and heroic enough in its place and time, is, it must be confessed, only possible as an habitual mood of the soul to narrow and unsympathetic characters. It proceeds altogether by exclusion. If I am a Stoic, the goods I cannot appropriate cease to be my goods, and the temptation lies very near to deny that they are goods at all. We find this mode of protecting the self by exclusion and denial very common among people who are in other respects not Stoics. All narrow people entrench their me. They retract it from the region of what they cannot securely possess. People who don't resemble them, or who treat them with indifference, people over whom they gain no influence, or people on whose existence, however meritorious it may intrinsically be, they look with chill negation, if not with positive hate. Who will not be mine I will exclude from existence altogether. That is, as far as I can make it so, such people shall be as if they were not. Thus may certain absoluteness and definiteness in the outline of my me console me for the smallness of its content. Sympathetic people, on the contrary, proceed by the entirely opposite way of expansion and inclusion. The outline of their self often gets uncertain enough, but for this the spread of its content more than atones. Nil humani me alienum. Let them despise this little person of mine, and treat me like dog. Shall not negate them so long as I have soul in my body. They are realities as much as I am. What positive good is in them shall be mine too, etc., etc. The magnanimity of these expansive natures is often touching indeed. Such persons can feel sort of delicate rapture in thinking that, however sick, ill-favored, mean-conditioned, and generally forsaken they may be, they yet are integral parts of the whole of this brave world, have fellows sharing the strength of the dray horses, the happiness of the young people, the wisdom of the wise ones, and are not altogether without part or lot in the good fortunes of the Vanderbilts and the Hohenzollerns themselves. Thus either by negating or by embracing, the ego may seek to establish itself in reality. He who, with Marcus Aurelius, can truly say, "But universe, I wish all that thou wishest has a self from which every trace of negativeness and obstructiveness has been removed. No wind can blow except to fill its sails." The hierarchy of the me, a tolerably unanimous opinion, ranges the different selves of which a man may be seized and possessed, and the consequent different orders of his self-regard in an hierarchical scale, with the bodily me at the bottom, the spiritual me at top, and the extracorporeal material selves and the various social selves between. Our merely natural self-seeking would lead us to aggrandize all these selves. We give up deliberately only those among them which we find we cannot keep. Our unselfishness is thus apt to be a virtue of necessity, and it is not without all show of reason that cynics quote the fable of the fox and the grapes in describing our progress therein. But this is the moral education of the race, and if we agree in the result that on the whole the selves we can keep are the intrinsically best, we need not complain of being led to the knowledge of their superior worth in such a tortuous way. Of course, this is not the only way in which we learn to subordinate our lower selves to our higher. A direct ethical judgment unquestionably also plays its part, and last, not least, we apply to our own persons judgments originally called forth by the acts of others. It is one of the strangest laws of our nature that many things which we are well satisfied within ourselves disgust us when seen in others. With another man's bodily hoggishness hardly anyone has any sympathy. Almost as little with his cupidity, his social vanity and eagerness, his jealousy, his despotism, and his pride. Left absolutely to myself, I should probably allow all these spontaneous tendencies to luxuriate in me unchecked, and it would be long before I formed a distinct notion of the order of their subordination. But having constantly to pass judgment on my associates, I come ere long to see, as Herr Horch says, my own lusts in the mirror of the lusts of others, and to think about them in a very different way from that in which I simply feel. Of course, moral generalities which from childhood have been instilled into me accelerate enormously the advent of this reflective judgment on myself. So it comes to pass that, as aforesaid, men have arranged the various selves which they may seek in an hierarchical scale according to their worth. A certain amount of bodily selfishness is required as a basis for all the other selves, but too much sensuality is despised, or at best condoned on account of the other quality of the individual. The wider material selves are regarded as higher than the immediate body. He is esteemed a poor creature who is unable to forego a little meat and drink and warmth and sleep for the sake of getting on in the world. The social self as a whole, again, ranks higher than the material self as a whole. We must care more for our honor, our friends, our human ties, than for a sound skin or wealth, and the spiritual self is so supremely precious that rather than lose it, a man ought to be willing to give up friends and good fame and property and life itself. In each kind of me, material, social, and spiritual, men distinguish between the immediate and actual, and the remote and potential, between the narrower and the wider view, to the detriment of the former and the advantage of the latter. One must forego a present bodily enjoyment for the sake of one's general health, and one must abandon the dollar in the hand for the sake of the $100 to come. One must make an enemy of his present interlocutor if thereby one makes friends of a more valued circle. One must go without learning and grace and wit, the better to compass one's soul's salvation. Of all these wider, more potential selves, the potential social me is the most interesting, by reason of certain apparent paradoxes to which it leads in conduct, and by reason of its connection with our moral and religious life. When for motives of honor and conscience I brave the condemnation of my own family, club, and sin. When, as a Protestant, I turn Catholic as a Catholic, freethinker as a regular practitioner, homeopath, or what not, I am always inwardly strengthened in my course and steeled against the loss of my actual social self by the thought of other and better possible social judges than those whose verdict goes against me now. The ideal social self which I thus seek in appealing to their decision may be very remote. It may be represented as barely possible. I may not hope for its realization during my lifetime. I may even expect of future generations, which would approve me if they knew me, to know nothing about me when I am dead and gone. Yet still the emotion that beckons me on is indubitably the pursuit of an ideal social self, a self that is at least worthy of approving recognition by the highest possible judging companion, if such companion there be. This self is the true, the intimate, the ultimate, the permanent me which I seek. This judge is God, the absolute mind, the great companion. We hear, in these days of scientific enlightenment, a great deal of discussion about the efficacy of prayer, and many reasons are given us why we should not pray, whilst others are given us why we should. But in all this very little is said of the reason why we do pray, which is simply that we cannot help praying. It seems probable that, in spite of all that science may do to the contrary, men will continue to pray to the end of time unless their mental nature changes in a manner which nothing we know should lead us to expect. The impulse to praise, a necessary consequence of the fact that whilst the innermost of the empirical selves of a man is a self of the social sort, it yet can find its only adequate socius in an ideal world. All progress in the social self is a substitution of higher tribunals for lower. This ideal tribunal is the highest, and most men, either continually or occasionally, carry a reference to it in their breast. The humblest outcast on this earth can feel himself to be real and valid by means of this higher recognition. And on the other hand, for most of us, a world with no such inner refuge when the outer social self failed and dropped from us would be the abyss. Or, I say it for most of us, because it is probable that individuals differ a good deal in the degree in which they are haunted by this sense of an ideal spectator. It is a much more essential part of the consciousness of some men than of others. Those who have the most of it are possibly the most religious men. But I am sure that even those who say they are altogether without it deceive themselves, and really have it in some degree. Only a non-gregarious animal could be completely without it. Probably no one can make sacrifices for right without to some degree personifying the principle of right for which the sacrifice is made and expecting thanks from it. Complete social unselfishness, in other words, can hardly exist. Complete social suicide hardly occurred to a man's mind. Even such texts as Job's, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, or Marcus Aurelius's, if gods hate me and my children there is a reason for it, can least of all be cited to prove the contrary. For beyond all doubt Job reveled in the thought of Jehovah's recognition of the worship after the slaying should have been done, and the Roman emperor felt sure the absolute reason would not be all indifferent to his acquiescence in the god's dislike. The old test of piety, are you willing to be damned for the glory of God, was probably never answered in the affirmative except by those who felt sure in their heart of hearts that God would credit them with their willingness, and set more store by them thus than if in his unfathomable scheme he had not damned them at all. Teleological uses of self-interest. On zoological principles it is easy to see why we have been endowed with impulses of self-seeking and with emotions of self-satisfaction, and the reverse. Unless our consciousness were something more than cognitive, unless it experienced partiality for certain of the objects which, in succession, occupy its ken, it could not long maintain itself in existence, for, by an inscrutable necessity, each human mind's appearance on this earth is conditioned upon the integrity of the body with which it belongs, upon the treatment which that body gets from others, and upon the spiritual dispositions which use it as their tool, and lead it either towards longevity or to destruction. Its own body, then, first of all, its friends next, and finally its spiritual dispositions must be the supremely interesting objects for each human mind. Each mind, to begin with, must have a certain minimum of selfishness in the shape of instincts of bodily self-seeking in order to exist. This minimum must be there as a basis for all farther conscious acts, whether of self-negation or of a selfishness more subtle still. All minds must have come by the way of the survival of the fittest, if by no directer path, to take an intense interest in the bodies to which they are yoked, altogether apart from any interest in the pure ego which they also possess, and similarly with the images of their person in the minds of others. I should not be extant now had I not become sensitive to looks of approval or disapproval on the faces among which my life is cast. Looks of contempt cast on other persons need affect me in no such peculiar way. My spiritual powers, again, must interest me more than those of other people, and for the same reason. I should not be here at all unless I had cultivated them and kept them from decay. And the same law which made me once care for them makes me care for them still. All these three things form the natural me, but all these things are objects, properly so called, to the thought which at any time may be doing the thinking, and if the zoological and evolutionary point of view is the true one, there is no reason why one object might not arouse passion and interest as primitively and instinctively as any other. The phenomenon of passion is in origin and essence the same, whatever be the target upon which it is discharged. But the target actually happens to be a solely question of fact. I might conceivably be as much fascinated, and as primitively so, by the care of my neighbor's body as by the care of my own. I am thus fascinated by the care of my child's body. The only check to such exuberant non-egoistic interests is natural selection, which would weed out such as were very harmful to the individual or to his tribe. Many such interests, however, remain unweeded out the interest in the opposite sex, for example, which seems in mankind stronger than is called for by its utilitarian need. And alongside of them remain interests like that in alcohol, intoxication, or in musical sounds, which, for aught we can see, are without any utility whatever. The sympathetic instincts and the egoistic ones are thus coordinate. They arise, so far as we can tell, on the same psychologic level. The only difference between them is that the instincts called egoistic form much the larger mass, the self as knower. The I, or pure ego, is very much more difficult subject of inquiry than the me. It is that which, at any given moment, is conscious, whereas the me is only one of the things which it is conscious of. In other words, it is the thinker, and the question immediately comes up, what is the thinker? Is it the passing state of consciousness itself, or is it something deeper and less mutable? The passing state we have seen to be the very embodiment of change. Yet each of us spontaneously considers that by I, he means something always the same. This has led most philosophers to postulate behind the passing state of consciousness permanent substance or agent, whose modification or act it is. This agent is the thinker. The state is only its instrument or means. Soul, a transcendental ego, a spirit, or so many names for this more permanent sort of thinker. Not discriminating them just yet, let us proceed to define our idea of the passing state of consciousness more clearly. The unity of the passing thought. Already, in speaking of sensations, from the point of view of Fechner's idea of measuring them, we saw that there was no ground for calling them compounds. But what is true of sensations cognizing simple qualities is also true of thoughts with complex objects composed of many parts. This proposition unfortunately runs counter to a widespread prejudice and will have to be defended at some length. Common sense and psychologists, almost every school, have agreed that whenever an object of thought contains many elements, the thought itself must be made up of just as many ideas, one idea for each element, all fused together in appearance but really separate. There can be no difficulty in admitting that association does form the ideas of an indefinite number of individuals into one complex idea, says James Mill, because it is an acknowledged fact. Have we not the idea of an army? And is not that precisely the ideas of an indefinite number of men formed into one idea? Similar quotations might be multiplied, and the reader's own first impressions probably would rally to their support. Suppose, for example, he thinks that the pack of cards is on the table. If he begins to reflect, he is as likely as not to say, well, isn't that a thought of the pack of cards? Isn't it of the cards as included in the pack? Isn't it of the table? And of the legs of the table as well? Hasn't my thought, then, all these parts? One part for the pack and another for the table? And within the pack part for each card, as within the table part for each leg, and isn't each of these parts an idea? And can thought, then, be anything but an assemblage or pack of ideas, each answering to some element of what it knows? Plausible as such considerations may seem, it is astonishing how little force they have in assuming. Pack of ideas, each cognizant of some one element of the fact one has assumed. Nothing has been assumed which knows the whole fact at once. The idea which, on the hypothesis of the pack of ideas, knows e.g., the ace of spades must be ignorant of the leg of the table, since to account for that knowledge another special idea is by the same hypothesis invoked, and so on with the rest of the ideas, all equally ignorant of each other's objects. And yet in the actual living human mind what knows the cards also knows the table, its legs, etc. For all these things are known in relation to each other and at once. Our notion of the abstract numbers 8, 4, 2 is as truly one feeling of the mind as our notion of simple unity. Our idea of a couple is not a couple of ideas, but, the reader may say, is not the taste of lemonade composed of that of lemon plus that of sugar? No. I reply, this is taking the combining of objects for that of feelings. The physical lemonade contains both the lemon and the sugar, but its taste does not contain their tastes. For if there are any two things which are certainly not present in the taste of lemonade, those are the pure lemon sour on the one hand and the pure sugar sweet on the other. These tastes are absent utterly. A taste somewhat like both of them is there, but that is a distinct state of mind. Altogether, distinct mental states cannot fuse. But not only is the notion that our ideas are combinations of smaller ideas improbable, it is logically unintelligible. It leaves out the essential features of all the combinations which we actually know. All the combinations which we actually know are effects wrought by the units said to be combined upon some entity other than themselves. Without this feature of a medium or vehicle, the notion of combination has no sense. In other words, no possible number of entities, call them as you like, whether forces, material particles, or mental elements, can sum themselves together. Each remains, in the sum, what it always was, and the sum itself exists only for a bystander who happens to overlook the units and to apprehend the sum as such, or else it exists in the shape of some other effect on an entity external to the sum itself. When H and O are said to combine into water, and thenceforward to exhibit new properties, though water is just the old atoms in the new position, HOH, the new properties are just their combined. X, when in this position, upon external media, such as our sense organs and the various reagents on which water may exert its properties and be known. Just so, the strength of many men may combine when they pull upon one rope, of many muscular fibers when they pull upon one tendon. In the parallelogram of forces, the forces do not combine themselves into the diagonal resultant. A body is needed on which they may impinge to exhibit the resultant effect. No more do musical sounds combine per into concords or discords. Concord and discord are names for their combined effects on that external medium, the ear, where the elemental units are supposed to be feelings. The case is in no wise altered. Take 100 of them, shuffle them, and pack them as close together as you can. Whatever that may mean, still each remains the same feeling it always was, shut in its own skin, windowless. Ignorant of what the other feelings are and mean, there would be 101st feeling there, if when a group or series of such feelings were set up, a consciousness belonging to the group as such should emerge, and this 101st feeling would be a totally new fact. The 100 original feelings might, by a curious physical law, be a signal for its creation. When they came together, we often have to learn things separately before we know them as a sum, but they would have no substantial identity with the new feeling, nor with them, and one could never deduce the one from the others, or in any intelligible sense say that they evolved it out of themselves. Take a sentence of a dozen words, and take 12 men and tell to each one word. Then stand the men in a row or jam them in a bunch, and let each think of his word as intently as he will. Nowhere will there be a consciousness of the whole sentence. We talk, it is true, of the spirit of the age and the sentiment of the people, and in various ways we hypothesize public opinion. But we know this to be symbolic speech, and never dream that the spirit, opinion, or sentiment constitutes a consciousness other than and additional to that of the several individuals whom the words age, people, or public denote. The private minds do not agglomerate into a higher compound mind. This has always been the invincible contention of the spiritualists against the associationists in psychology. The associationists say the mind is constituted by a multiplicity of distinct ideas associated into a unity. There is, they say, an idea of A and also an idea of B. Therefore, they say there is an idea. A plus B or of A and B together, which is like saying that the mathematical square of A plus that of B is equal to the square of A plus B. A palpable and truth idea of A plus idea of B is not identical with idea of A plus B. Is one, there are two in it. One knows also knows B in them. One knows is expressly posited as not knowing B, etc. In short, the two separate ideas can never by any logic be made to figure as one idea. If one idea of A plus B, for example, come as a matter of fact after the two separate ideas of A and a B, then we must hold it to be as direct. A product of the later conditions as the two separate ideas were of the earlier conditions. The simplest thing, therefore, if we are to assume the existence of a stream of consciousness at all, would be to suppose that things that are known together are known in single pulses of that stream. The things may be many, and may occasion many currents in the brain, but the psychic phenomenon correlative to these many currents is one integral state, transitive or substantive, to which the many things appear, the soul as a combining medium. The spiritualists in philosophy have been prompt to see that things which are known together are known by one something, but that something, they say, is no mere passing thought, but a simple and permanent spiritual being on which many ideas combine their effects. It makes no difference in this connection whether this being be called soul, ego, or spirit. In either case, its chief function is that of a combining medium. This is a different vehicle of knowledge from that in which we just said that the mystery of knowing thing together might be most simply lodged. Which is the real knower, this permanent being, or our passing state? If we had other grounds, not yet considered, for admitting the soul into our psychology, then getting there on those grounds, she might turn out to be the knower too. But if there be no other grounds for admitting the soul, we had better cling to our passing states as the exclusive agents of knowledge, for we have to assume their existence anyhow in psychology, and the knowing of many things together is just as well accounted for when we call it one of their functions as when we call it a reaction of the soul. Explained it is not by either conception, and has to figure in psychology as a datum that is ultimate. But there are other alleged grounds for admitting the soul into psychology, and the chief of them is the sense of personal identity. In the last chapter it was stated that the thoughts which we actually know to exist do not fly about loose, but seem each to belong to some one thinker and not to another. Each thought, out of a multitude of other thoughts of which it may think, is able to distinguish those which belong to it from those which do not. The former have a warmth and intimacy about them of which the latter are completely devoid, and the result is a me of yesterday, judged to be in some peculiarly subtle sense the same with the I who now make the judgment. As a mere subjective phenomenon, the judgment presents no special mystery. It belongs to the great class, judgments of sameness, and there is nothing more remarkable in making a judgment of sameness in the first person than in the second or the third. The intellectual operations seem essentially alike, whether I say I am the same as I was, or whether I say the pen is the same as it was yesterday. It is as easy to think this as to think the opposite, and say neither of us is the same. The only question which we have to consider is whether it be a right judgment. Is sameness predicated really there? Sameness in the self as known. If in the sentence, I am the same that I was yesterday, we take the I broadly, it is evident that in many ways I am not the same. As concrete me, I am somewhat different from what I was. Then hungry, now full, then walking, now at rest, then poor, now richer, then younger, now older, etc. And yet in other ways I am the same, and we may call these the essential ways. My name and profession and relations to the world are identical. My face, my faculties and store of memories are practically indistinguishable now and then. Moreover, the me of now and the me of then are continuous. The alterations were gradual and never affected the whole of me at once. So far, then, my personal identity is just like the sameness predicated of any other aggregate thing. It is conclusion grounded either on the resemblance in essential respects or on the continuity of the phenomena compared. And it must not be taken to mean more than the grounds warrant, or treated as sort of metaphysical or absolute unity in which all differences are overwhelmed. The past and present selves compared are the same just so far as they are the same, and no farther. They are the same in kind. But this generic sameness coexists with generic differences just as real, and if from the one point of view I am one self, from another I am quite as truly many. Similarly of the attribute of continuity, it gives to the self the unity of mere connectedness, or unbrokenness, perfectly definite phenomenal thing. But it gives not jot or tittle more. Sameness in the self as knower. But all this is said only of the me, or self as known. In the judgment I am the same, etc. The I was taken broadly as a concrete person. Suppose, however, that we take it narrowly as a thinker, as that to which all the concrete determinations of the me belong and are known, does there not then appear an absolute identity at different times? That's something which at every moment goes out and knowingly appropriates the me of the past and discards the non-me as foreign, is it not? A permanent abiding principle of spiritual activity identical with itself wherever found? That it is such. A principle is the reigning doctrine both of philosophy and common sense, and yet reflection finds it difficult to justify the idea. If there were no passing states of consciousness, then indeed we might suppose an abiding principle, absolutely one with itself, to be the ceaseless thinker in each one of us. But if the states of consciousness be accorded as realities, no such substantial identity in the thinker need be supposed. Yesterday's and today's state of consciousnesses have no substantial identity, for when one is here the other is irrevocably dead and gone. But they have a functional identity, for both know the same objects, and so far as the bygone me is one of those objects, they react upon it in an identical way, reading it and calling it mine, and opposing it to all the other things they know. This functional identity seems really the only sort of identity in the thinker which the facts require us to suppose. Successive thinkers, numerically distinct, but all aware of the same past in the same way, form an adequate vehicle for all the experience of personal unity and sameness which we actually have. And just such, a train of successive thinkers is the stream of mental states, each with its complex object cognized and emotional and selective reaction thereupon, which psychology treated as, and natural science has to assume. The logical conclusion seems then to be that the states of consciousness are all that psychology needs to do her work with. Metaphysics or theology may prove this soul to exist, but for psychology the hypothesis of such a substantial principle of unity is superfluous. How the I appropriates the me. But why should each successive mental state appropriate the same past me? I spoke a while ago of my own past experiences appearing to me with a warmth and intimacy which the experiences thought of by me as having occurred to other people lack. This leads us to the answer so. My present me is filled with warmth and intimacy. The heavy warm mass of my body is there, and the nucleus of the spiritual me, the sense of intimate activity, is there. We cannot realize our present self without simultaneously feeling one or other of the two things. Any other object of thought which brings these two things with it into consciousness will be thought with. A warmth and an intimacy like those which cling to the present me. Any distant object which fulfills this condition will be thought with such warmth and intimacy. But which distant objects do fulfill the condition when represented? Obviously those, and only those, which fulfilled it when they were alive. Them we shall still represent with the animal warmth upon them, and to them may possibly still cling the flavor of the inner activity taken in the act. And by a natural consequence, we shall assimilate them to each other and to the warm and intimate self we now feel within us as we think, and separate them as a collection from whatever objects have not this mark, much as out of a herd of cowlet, loose for the winter on some wide western prairie, the owner picks out and sorts together, when the round up comes in the spring, all the beasts on which he finds his own particular brand. Well, just such objects are the past experiences which I now call mine. Other men's experiences, no matter how much I may know about them, never bear this vivid, this peculiar brand. This is why Peter, awakening in the same bed with Paul, and recalling what both had in mind before they went to sleep, re-identifies and appropriates the warm ideas as his, and is never tempted to confuse them with those cold and pale appearing ones which he ascribes to Paul. As well might he confound Paul's body, which he only sees, with his own. Body which he sees but also feels. Each of us, when he awakens, says, "Here's the same old me again," just as he says, "Here's the same old bed, the same old room, the same old world." And similarly in our waking hours. Though each pulse of consciousness dies away and is replaced by another, yet that other, among the things it knows its own predecessor, and finding it warm in the way we have described, greets it, saying, "Thou art mine, and part of the same self with me." Each later thought, knowing and including thus the thoughts that went before, is the final receptacle, and appropriating them is the final owner of all that they contain and own. As Kant says, it is as if elastic balls were to have not only motion but knowledge of it, and first ball were to transmit both its motion and its consciousness to second, which took both up into its consciousness and passed them to third, until the last ball held all that the other balls had held, realized it as its own. It is this trick which the nascent thought has of immediately taking up the expiring thought and adopting it, which leads to the appropriation of most of the remoter constituents of the self. Who owns the last self owns the self before the last, for what possesses the possessor possesses the possessed. It is impossible to discover any verifiable features in personal identity which this sketch does not contain, impossible to imagine how any transcendent principle of unity, were such a principle there, could shape matters to any other result, or be known by any other fruit, than just this production of a stream of consciousness, each successive part of which should know, and knowing, hug to itself and adopt all those that went before, thus standing as a representative of an entire past stream with which it is in no wise to be identified. Mutations and multiplications of the self. The me, like every other aggregate, changes as it grows. The passing states of consciousness, which should preserve in their succession an identical knowledge of its past, wander from their duty, letting large portions drop from out of their ken, and representing other portions wrong. The identity which we recognize as we survey the long procession can only be the relative identity of a slow shifting in which there is always some common ingredient retained. The commonest element of all, the most uniform, is the possession of some common memories. However different the man may be from the youth, both look back on the same childhood and call it their own. Thus the identity found by the eye in its me is only a loosely construed thing, an identity on the whole, just like that which any outside observer might find in the same assemblage of facts. We often say of a man he is so changed one would not know him, and so does a man less often speak of himself. These changes in the me, recognized by the eye, or by outside observers, may be grave or slight. They deserve some notice here. The mutations of the self may be divided into two main classes, a. Alterations of memory, and b. Alterations in the present bodily and spiritual selves. A. Of the alterations of memory little need be said. They are so familiar. Losses of memory are a normal incident in life, especially in advancing years, and the person's me, as realized, shrinks pari passu with the facts that disappear. The memory of dreams and of experiences in the hypnotic trance rarely survives. False memories, also, are by no means rare occurrences, and whenever they occur they distort our consciousness of our me. Most people probably are in doubt about certain matters ascribed to their past. They may have seen them, may have said them, done them, or they may only have dreamed or imagined they did so. The content of dream will oftentimes insert itself into the stream of real life in most perplexing way. The most frequent source of false memory is the accounts we give to others of our experiences. Such accounts we almost always make both more simple and more interesting than the truth. We quote what we should have said or done, rather than what we really said or did. And in the first telling we may be fully aware of the distinction. But ere long the fiction expels the reality from memory and reigns in its stead alone. This is one great source of the fallibility of testimony meant to be quite honest. especially where the marvelous is concerned. The story takes tilt that way, and the memory follows the story. B. When we pass beyond alterations of memory to normal alterations in the present self, we have graver disturbances. These alterations are of three main types, but our knowledge of the elements and causes of these changes of personality is so slight that the division into types must not be regarded as having any profound significance. The types are A. Insane delusions. B. Alternating selves. G. Mediumships or possessions. A. In insanity, we often have delusions projected into the past, which are melancholic or sanguine according to the character of the disease. But the worst alterations of the self come from present perversions of sensibility and impulse which leave the past undisturbed, but induce the patient to think that the present me is an altogether new personage. Something of this sort happens normally in the rapid expansion of the whole character, intellectual as well as volitional, which takes place after the time of puberty. The pathological cases are curious enough to merit longer notice. The basis of our personality, as M. Ribot says, is that feeling of our vitality which, because it is so perpetually present, remains in the background of our consciousness, but is the basis because, always present, always acting, without peace or rest, it knows neither sleep nor feigning, and lasts as long as life itself, of which it is one form. It serves as a support to that self-conscious me which memory constitutes. It is the medium of association among its other parts. Suppose now that it were possible at once to change our body and put another into its place. Skeleton, vessels, viscera, muscles, skin, everything made new, except the nervous system with its stored-up memory of the past. There can be no doubt that in such a case the afflux of unaccustomed vital sensations would produce the gravest disorders. Between the old sense of existence engraved on the nervous system and the new one acting with all the intensity of its reality and novelty, there would be irreconcilable contradiction. What the particular perversions of the bodily sensibility may be which give rise to these contradictions is, for the most part, impossible for a sound-minded person to conceive. One patient has another self that repeats all his thoughts for him. Others, amongst whom are some of the first characters in history, have internal demons who speak with them and are replied to. Another feels that someone mimics his thoughts for him. Another has two bodies, lying in different beds. Some patients feel as if they had lost parts of their bodies, teeth, brain, stomach, etc. In some it is made of wood, glass, butter, etc. In some it does not exist any longer, or is dead, or is a foreign object quite separate from the speaker's self. Occasionally parts of the body lose their connection for consciousness with the rest and are treated as belonging to another person and moved by a hostile will. Thus the right hand may fight with the left as with an enemy, or the cries of the patient himself are assigned to another person with whom the patient expresses sympathy. The literature of insanity is filled with narratives of such illusions as these. M. Taine quotes from A Patient of Dr. Krishiber an account of sufferings, from which it will be seen how completely aloof from what is normal a man's experience may suddenly become. After the first or second day it was for some weeks impossible to observe or analyze myself. The suffering, angina pectoris, was too overwhelming. It was not till the first days of January that I could give an account to myself of what I experienced. Here is the first thing of which I retain clear remembrance. I was alone, and already prey to permanent visual trouble, when I was suddenly seized with visual trouble infinitely more pronounced. Objects grew small and receded to infinite distances. Men and things together. I was myself immeasurably far away. I looked about me with terror and astonishment. The world was escaping from me. I remarked at the same time that my voice was extremely far away from me, that it sounded no longer as of mine. I struck the ground with my foot and perceived its resistance, but this resistance seemed illusory, not that the soul was soft, but that the weight of my body was reduced to almost nothing. I had the feeling of being without weight. In addition to being so distant, objects appeared to me flat. When I spoke with anyone, I saw him like an image cut out of paper with no relief. This sensation lasted intermittently for 2 years. Constantly it seemed as if my legs did not belong to me. It was almost as bad with my arms. As for my head, it seemed no longer to exist. I appeared to myself to act automatically by an impulsion foreign to myself. There was inside of me a new being and another part of myself, the old being, which took no interest in the newcomer. I distinctly remember saying to myself that the sufferings of this new being were to me indifferent. I was never really dupe of these illusions, but my mind grew often tired of incessantly correcting the new impressions, and I let myself go, and live the unhappy life of this new entity. I had an ardent desire to see my old world again, to get back to my old self. This desire kept me from killing myself. I was another, and I despised this other. He was perfectly odious to me. It was certainly another who had taken my form and assumed my functions. In cases like this, it is as certain that the I is unaltered as that the me is changed. That is to say, the present thought of the patient is cognitive of both the old me and the new, so long as its memory holds good. Only, within that objective sphere which formerly lent itself so simply to the judgment of recognition and of egoistic appropriation, strange perplexities have arisen. The present and the past, both seen therein, will not unite. Where is my old me? What is this new one? Are they the same, or have I two? Such questions, answered by whatever theory the patient is able to conjure up as plausible, form the beginning of his insane life. b. The phenomenon of alternating personality in its simplest phases seems based on lapses of memory. Any man becomes, as we say, inconsistent with himself if he forgets his engagements, pledges, knowledges, and habits, and it is merely a question of degree at what point we shall say that his personality is changed. But in the pathological cases known as those of double or alternate personality, the loss of memory is abrupt, and is usually preceded by a period of unconsciousness or syncope lasting variable length of time. In the hypnotic trance we can easily produce an alteration of the personality, either by telling the subject to forget all that has happened to him since such or such date, in which case he becomes, it may be, child again, or by telling him he is another altogether imaginary personage, in which case all facts about himself seem for the time being to lapse from out his mind, and he throws himself into the new character with vivacity proportionate to the amount of histrionic imagination which he possesses. But in the pathological cases the transformation is spontaneous. The most famous case, perhaps, on record is that of Felida X, reported by a doctor as Emma Bordo. At the age of 14 this woman began to pass into secondary state characterized by change in her general disposition and character, as if certain inhibitions, previously existing, were suddenly removed. During the secondary state she remembered the first state, but on emerging from it into the first state she remembered nothing of the second. At the age of 44 the duration of the secondary state, which was on the whole superior in quality to the original state, had gained upon the latter so much as to occupy most of her time. During it she remembers the events belonging to the original state, but her complete oblivion of the secondary state when original state recurs is often very distressing to her, as, for example, when the transition takes place in a carriage on her way to a funeral, and she has no idea which one of her friends may be dead. She actually became pregnant during one of her early secondary states, and during her first state had no knowledge of how it had come to pass. Her distress at these blanks of memory is sometimes intense, and once drove her to attempt suicide. M. Pierre Janet describes. A still more remarkable case as follows. Leni B., whose life sounds more like an improbable romance than a genuine history, has had attacks of natural somnambulism since the age of 3 years. She has been hypnotized constantly by all sorts of persons from the age of 16 upwards, and she is now 45. Whilst her normal life developed in one way in the midst of her per-country surroundings, her second life was passed in drawing-rooms and doctors' offices, and naturally took an entirely different direction. Today, when in her normal state, this poor peasant woman is serious and rather sad person, calm and slow, very mild with every one, and extremely timid. To look at her one would never suspect the personage which she contains. But hardly is she put to sleep hypnotically when a metamorphosis occurs. Her face is no longer the same. She keeps her eyes closed, it is true, but the acuteness of her other senses supplies their place. She is gay, noisy, restless, sometimes insupportably so. She remains good-natured, but has acquired a singular tendency to irony and sharp jesting. Nothing is more curious than to hear her after sitting when she has received a visit from strangers who wish to see her asleep. She gives a word portrait of them, apes their manners, claims to know their little ridiculous aspects and passions, and for each invents a romance. To this character must be added the possession of an enormous number of recollections, whose existence she does not even suspect when awake, for her amnesia is then complete. She refuses the name of Leni and takes that of Leontine Lenitu, to which her first magnetizers had accustomed her. That good woman is not myself, she says. She is too stupid. To herself, Leontine, or Lenitu, she attributes all the sensations and all the actions, in word all the conscious experiences, which she has undergone in somnambulism, and knits them together to make the history of her already long life. To Leni one, as M. Janet calls the waking woman, on the other hand, she exclusively ascribes the events lived through in waking hours. I was at first struck by an important exception to the rule, and was disposed to think that there might be something arbitrary in this partition of her recollections. In the normal state, Leonie has husband and children, but Leonie, too, the somnambulist, whilst acknowledging the children as her own, attributes the husband to the other. This choice was perhaps explicable, but it followed no rule. It was not till later that I learned that her magnetizers in early days, as audacious as certain hypnotizers of recent date, had somnambulized her for her first accoutrements, and that she had lapsed into that state spontaneously in the later ones. Leonie, too, was thus quite right in ascribing to herself the children. It was she who had them, and the rule that her first trance state forms different. Personality was not broken, but it is the same with her second or deepest state of trance, when after the renewed passes, syncope, etc. She reaches the condition which I have called Leonie 3. She is another person still, serious and grave. Instead of being restless child, she speaks slowly and moves but little. Again she separates herself from the waking Leonie 1. "'Twas good but rather stupid woman," she says, "and not me." And she also separates herself from Leonie 2. "How can you see anything in me in that crazy creature?" she says. Unfortunately, I am nothing for her. In mediumships or possessions, the invasion and the passing away of the secondary state are both relatively abrupt, and the duration of the state is usually short, i.e., from few minutes to few hours. Whenever the secondary state is well developed, no memory for aught that happened during it remains after the primary consciousness comes back. The subject during the secondary consciousness speaks, writes, or acts as if animated by a foreign person, and often names this foreign person and gives his history. In old times, the foreign control was usually demon, and is so now in communities which favor that belief. With us he gives himself out at the worst for an Indian or other grotesquely speaking but harmless personage. Usually he purports to be the spirit of a dead person known or unknown to those present, and the subject is then what we call a medium. Mediumistic possession in all its grades seems to form a perfectly natural special type of alternate personality, and the susceptibility to it in some form is by no means an uncommon gift in persons who have no other obvious nervous anomaly. The phenomena are very intricate, and are only just beginning to be studied in a proper scientific way. The lowest phase of mediumship is automatic writing, and the lowest grade of that is where the subject knows what words are coming, but feels impelled to write them as if from without. Then comes writing unconsciously, even whilst engaged in reading or talk, inspirational speaking, playing on musical instruments, etc. Also belong to the relatively lower phases of possession, in which the normal self is not excluded from conscious participation in the performance, though their initiative seems to come from elsewhere. In the highest phase the trance is complete, the voice, language, and everything are changed, and there is no after-memory whatever until the next trance comes. One curious thing about trance utterances is their generic similarity in different individuals. The control here in America is either a grotesque, slangy, and flippant personage, Indian controls, calling the ladies a squaws, the men a braves, the house a wigwam, etc., etc., are excessively common, or, if he ventures on higher intellectual flights, he abounds in a curiously vague optimistic philosophy in water, in which phrases about spirit, harmony, beauty law, progression, development, etc., keep recurring. It seems exactly as if one author composed more than half of the trance messages, no matter by whom they are uttered, whether all subconscious selves are peculiarly susceptible to a certain stratum of the zeitgeist, and get their inspiration from it, I know not. But this is obviously the case with the secondary selves which become developed in spiritualist circles, though the beginnings of the medium trance are indistinguishable from effects of hypnotic suggestion. The subject assumes the role of medium simply because opinion expects it of him under the conditions which are present, and carries it out with feebleness or vivacity proportionate to his histrionic gifts. But the odd thing is that persons unexposed to spiritualist traditions will so often act in the same way when they become entranced, speak in the name of the departed, go through the motions of their several death agonies, send messages about their happy home in the summerland, describe the ailments of those present. I have no theory to publish of these cases, the actual beginning of several of which I have personally seen. I am, however, persuaded by abundant acquaintance with the trances of one medium that the control may be altogether different from any possible waking self of the person. In the case I have in mind, it professes to be certain departed French doctor, and is, I am convinced, acquainted with facts about the circumstances and the living and dead relatives and acquaintances of numberless sitters whom the medium never met before, and of whom she has never heard the names. I record my bare opinion here unsupported by the evidence, not, of course, in order to convert anyone to my view, but because I am persuaded that serious study of these trance phenomena is one of the greatest needs of psychology, and think that my personal confession may possibly draw a reader or two into field which the soidus and scientist usually refuses to explore. Review and psychological conclusion. To sum up this long chapter, the consciousness of self involves a stream of thought, each part of which is I can remember those which went before, know the things they knew, and care paramountly for certain ones among them as me, and appropriate to these the rest. This me is an empirical aggregate of things objectively known. The I which knows them cannot itself be an aggregate, neither for psychological purposes need it be an unchanging metaphysical entity like the soul, or a principle like the transcendental ego, viewed as out of time. It is the thought at each moment different from that of the last moment, but appropriative of the latter, together with all that the latter called its own. All the experiential facts find their place in this description, unencumbered with any hypothesis save that of the existence of passing thoughts or states of mind. If passing thoughts be the directly verifiable existence which no school has hitherto doubted them to be, then they are the only knower which psychology, treated as, and natural science, need take any account. The only pathway that I can discover for bringing in a more transcendental thinker would be to deny that we have any such direct knowledge of the existence of our states of consciousness as common sense supposes us to possess. The existence of the states in question would then be a mere hypothesis, or one way of asserting that there must be, and no correlative to all this known, but the problem who that knower is would have become a metaphysical problem, with the question once stated in these terms, the notion either of a spirit of the world which thinks through us, or that of set of individual substantial souls must be considered as prima facie on par with our own psychological solution, and discussed impartially. I myself believe that room for much future inquiry lies in this direction. The states of mind which every psychologist believes in are by no means clearly apprehensible, if distinguished from their objects, but to doubt them lies beyond the scope of our natural science point of view. And in this book the provisional solution which we have reached must be the final word. The thoughts themselves are the thinkers. This has been part 6 of Psych for Psychology's reading of Psychology, the book by William James. Thanks for listening.